It was exactly midnight when the shadow of a billion-dollar empire crossed the threshold of a man who owned nothing but his integrity. The city was quiet, wrapped in a soft curtain of rain that fell without hurry, as though even the sky was holding its breath for what was about to happen. Mason Rudd sat at his sticky kitchen table, the kind of table that had seen too many overdue bills and too many cold dinners eaten alone. The low hum of his old refrigerator filled the silence, a noise he still couldn't afford to fix, a small reminder that life had not been generous to him. His son, Jace, was asleep in the next room, curled beneath a blanket that had been washed so many times it had lost its color. Mason had just finished a double shift. His hands still smelled of oil and metal. His back ached. But he was at peace, the way a man is at peace when he has nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. When the knock came at his door, he assumed it was a bill collector, maybe a late customer with a broken engine who had no one else to call. He dried his hands on a rag, pushed back his chair, and walked to the door without rushing, because Mason Rudd had learned long ago that panic never fixed anything. He opened the door, and the world he thought he understood shifted beneath his feet. Standing on his doorstep, under the dim yellow light of a single bulb that buzzed whenever it rained, was Elena Dare. She was not wearing the tailored suit he remembered. She was not surrounded by assistants or protected by the invisible armor of wealth and power that had always seemed to follow her like a second shadow. She was wearing a simple gray hoodie and sweatpants. Her hair was loose and damp from the rain. Her face was pale, her eyes red, her cheeks still carrying the tracks of tears that had only recently stopped falling. She looked, in that moment, like someone who had finally put down something very heavy and was not yet sure how to stand without the weight of it. Mason said nothing. He just looked at her. She leaned against his doorframe, as though she needed it to hold her up, and she whispered words that cracked the silence like glass. "I left him because he wasn't you." To understand why a woman who owned half the skyline was standing at a mechanic store at midnight, you have to go back. You have to go back to the day the world collapsed for the Dare family, and to the quiet afternoon when a man who had every reason to be bitter chose grace instead. Elena Dare was the kind of woman people wrote about in business magazines. The daughter of a billionaire, she had taken her father's company and doubled it. She sat in glass offices above the clouds and made decisions that moved markets. She had been called brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and cold, often in the same sentence. She did not apologize for her ambition. She wore it like jewelry. Mason Rudd had once worked in one of her warehouses. He was a mechanic by trade, a hard worker by nature, and a man of quiet dignity by choice. He was not wealthy. He was not connected. He did not come from a family with a name anyone recognized. But he showed up every single day, did his job without complaint, and treated every person around him with a respect that had nothing to do with their title or their bank balance. Years ago, Elena had stood in the cold glass lobby of her own building and mocked him in front of a boardroom full of people. She had called him warehouse trash. She had called him a charity case. She had looked at a man who gave everything he had to his work and reduced him to nothing with a handful of words, the way powerful people sometimes do when they have forgotten what it costs to be ordinary. She had watched him walk away with his toolbox and his dignity, and she had told herself that she was too big and he was too small, and that was simply the way the world worked. But the world had a way of correcting that kind of thinking. Elena's niece, Arabella, was 9 years old and full of the kind of life that makes a room brighter just by entering it. She loved drawing horses and eating strawberry ice cream and asking questions that adults didn't always know how to answer. And then one morning, she got sick, and then sicker. And within weeks, she was lying in a pediatric ICU, fading in the slow and terrible way that children sometimes fade when their bodies turn against them without warning or reason. The doctors said her only hope was a blood transfusion. Not just any blood. She had a type so rare that the physicians described it in careful clinical language that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. They said finding a match would be close to miraculous. The Dare family, for all their wealth, for all their connections and influence and power, could not buy what Arabella needed. They could only wait and hope and watch the monitors and hold her hand. Across the city, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Mason Rudd walked into a community blood donation clinic. He hadn't been asked to come. No one had called him. He had seen a flyer on a telephone pole outside his shop 3 days earlier, and it had stayed with him, the way small things sometimes do when we are paying attention. He didn't have money to give. He didn't have connections or resources or anything the world typically considers valuable. But he had his blood, and he had his time, and he had a quiet belief that his struggle ought to mean something to someone else. So he sat down in the blue vinyl chair, rolled up his sleeve, and gave what he had. He did not know the child was a Dare. He did not know that his rare blood type, O negative with an antigen pattern the nurses said they almost never saw, was the only thing standing between a little girl named Arabella and a grief that would have hollowed out her family for the rest of their lives. He simply gave because giving was what a person of conscience did when they had the ability and someone had the need. When Elena Dare saw Mason Rudd through the hospital glass, she did not recognize him at first. She was watching the transfusion, holding her sister's hand, too exhausted for tears. And then she looked at the man in the chair, and the world went very still inside her. She recognized the set of his shoulders. She recognized the calm in his face. She recognized the hands that had once carried a toolbox out of her building while she watched from above, satisfied that she had made the right decision. It was Mason, the man she had humiliated in front of a room full of witnesses, the man she had dismissed as too small for her world. He was here. He was saving her niece's life. And he didn't even know who the blood was going to. Shame came for her then, not gently, but like a blade. Every word she had said to him returned to her in that moment, fully formed, with the weight they had always carried but she had never allowed herself to feel. She had built walls of power and called them strength. She had looked down on quiet men and called it discernment. She had surrounded herself with wealth and ambition and called it a life. And here was Mason Rudd, with his 2 jobs and his sticky kitchen table and his son who needed a blanket and a father, doing more good in a single afternoon than she had done in years of press releases and charitable galas where the photos always mattered more than the cause. After Arabella recovered, Elena could not stop thinking. She had people investigate Mason, expecting to find bitterness, expecting to find a man who had spent years sharpening his resentment into something sharp and ready. Instead, she found a man who worked 2 jobs without complaint, who helped his son with homework at the same table where the bills sat unpaid, who coached a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings because no one else had volunteered, who had never once, as far as anyone could find, spoken a single unkind word about the woman who took his dignity and watched him walk away. He had simply kept living, quietly, faithfully, without bitterness. That was the thing that finally broke her open. She had been engaged to a powerful investor. Their lives looked perfect from the outside, the kind of perfection that photographs well and means very little. On the evening she found herself standing at Mason's door, she ended the engagement at dinner, in a restaurant that cost more per plate than Mason earned in a week, while her fiancé stared at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had. Or maybe she had finally found it. She told Mason all of this in the doorway, slowly and without performance, while the rain continued to fall and the city hummed its distant, indifferent hum. She told him that the men in her world were big in their own minds, but hollow in the places that mattered. She told him that she had spent her life searching for someone powerful and had been looking in entirely the wrong direction. She told him that watching him give life to a family that had humiliated him was the single most powerful thing she had ever witnessed, and that she had not been able to unknow it, no matter how hard she had tried. Mason listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer a speech or a performance of forgiveness designed to make her feel worse before she felt better. When she finished, he looked at her with the same steady, unhurried eyes he had used the day she fired him, and he told her the truth that had kept him upright through all of it, that he had forgiven her long ago. Not for her sake, for his own, because life was too short and too precious to carry poison in your chest, and because the moment you decide that someone else's cruelty defines you, you have given them a power over your life they were never meant to have. He told her this simply, the way a man speaks when he has thought something through completely and no longer needs to